Hey, this is Digital Byte Computing. We're going to be talking about the operating system wars. Should you go for Microsoft for your Windows stuff? Should you go for Mac OS? Or should you go into the Linux arena? We're going to talk about all that right after this. So my name is Emilio. I work in the IT industry and I have the privilege to be able to work with all of the OS vendors that are out there on a day-to-day basis. And look, I love them all, but we're going to talk about what are the differences about each one and which one you should get. So let's just start off with Microsoft Windows. You probably are aware Microsoft Windows is the leader, right? Microsoft is the biggest market holder when it comes to operating systems for your personal computers. They're the ones who came out and that were in the cheaper end. They made it, I guess Bill Gates and those sort of guys had the good marketing abilities to be able to push this particular operating system out to the mainstream. And as a result, the majority of computers around the world will be running Microsoft Windows. Whether you're running Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, or Windows 10, you could also be working with some of the Windows server fleets if you are inclined to work in the server environment. But Windows is one of those operating systems that a lot of applications have been written for it. So a lot of manufacturers, right, a lot of people who've done hardware, a lot of people who've done software have written a lot of applications, have designed hardware around the Windows operating system. So you're going to find that generally when you're looking for certain types of applications, there is a much vaster, a much broader selection for you to choose if you choose to go down the Windows fleet. Now, the negative side of Windows, of course, is that you are then prone to all of your viruses. Because it is the market leader, right? Because most companies and most large-scale enterprises, even home users, will be running Windows, there is more of a case for an attacker, a hacker, to actually try to infect a computer, right? You're not going to want to infect you're not going to want to write a very specific virus for perhaps for a Mac or for a Linux. If some big company is running just Windows, you want to target those computers that are running the Microsoft Windows fleet. So that is the negative side of Microsoft Windows. But look, other than that, it is a great operating system. It's been around for a very long time. It's had a lot of good upgrades over the years. Sometimes they've released Microsoft Windows updates, such as, they released Windows ME, which is a complete flop. They released other smaller variations, Windows, Windows 8 came out, and then Windows 8.1 came out only a little while later. So those sort of things, Microsoft have learned from their mistakes, and the current version of Windows 10 is actually quite good. It can do a lot of the good things, and a lot of the old features that were available on Windows have been retained. Some additional features have been added, and some of the annoying features of the older versions of Windows, such as a lot of those notifications and you had to say yes and accept all this sort of stuff, have been removed. So it is actually a great operating system. The Mac operating system is growing and has grown substantially over the last number of years. So if you go back 10, 15 years, the Mac OS was very, very slim. It wasn't as popular as it is today. Now it is a genuine competitor against the Microsoft Windows fleet. What helped the Apple Mac get into the limelight was a lot to do with the release of the iPod and then the release of the iPhone and the iPad. That got a lot more people interested in the Apple brand and made them go, hey, this iPhone is actually pretty cool. It's very easy to use. I'm going to look at the Mac operating system, or let's look at the Macs themselves, the computers. Let's see what they're like. So they have picked up a lot more traction than they have before. They're still got a way to go before they catch up to Windows, but the time is near, I believe. I think that the Mac operating system has developed and has evolved so much over the last few years that there is a very good chance that in the near future, it'll overpass the Windows fleet. A lot of people may not think that, but look, unfortunately, it is the case. Windows is good, right? But Apple is getting there, and it's actually getting a lot more market share than it used to. You look at graphs of the trajectory of the growth of of the Apple operating system compared to the Windows operating system. The Apple operating system is generally going up. The Microsoft is sort of steady, going down, and it's not really growing as quick as the Apple the operating system is. And that is a lot to do with the iOS, with the iPhone and the iPad releases of the hardware, right? Now, the thing about Apple is, unlike the Microsoft fleet, you are going to be less likely to get prone with all of the problems and the viruses and the attacks as the Windows fleet. Now, not saying that the Mac is invincible, right? It's not invincible. Like, there is definitely stuff being written every single day to counteract and to break into that Mac operating system. This has a lot to do with the Mac growing so much and now having a substantial impact in the industry. There's a lot more computers, a lot more home computers at home, like a lot more home users that are using Mac. There's a lot more businesses, substantially a lot more businesses that are choosing to go down the Mac route. You'll find that companies that are, that deal heavily in multimedia, editing of videos and photo editing sort of companies, and all those sort of companies that really deal with developers and designing and that sort of stuff will generally are going more anyway towards the Mac operating system as opposed to Windows. So as a result of that, there is a lot more hackers, a lot more, these sort of people that are trying to infiltrate the Mac operating system than ever before. Now, you will find that the Mac operating system sits behind a Unix backend. So Unix is essentially the core system that runs the Mac operating system, which is generally very secure and has a lot of good parameters around it. But it is still not hacker proof, right? There is still ways to get through it. And as the Mac, unfortunately, as the Mac does continue to grow, the vulnerabilities and the security concerns around buying a Mac that are present in Windows will only rise, right? The Windows fleet is already prone with a lot of that stuff, and you have to, buy your antiviruses and you have to get all your firewalls in place and do all this sort of stuff. On the Mac, you can generally get by without that sort of stuff, without having the firewall enabled, without having an antivirus, like Symantec or McAfee or one of those. You don't have to have one of those on the Mac necessarily. It's always recommended, but it's not as required on the Mac operating system as Windows. Now, the other thing is that because of the rapid growth of the Mac, there's a lot more companies now investing money to build their apps, right? To actually build their software for both Windows and the Mac. So a lot of the programs that you couldn't buy on the Mac previously, you can now buy on the Mac as well as Windows. So in a lot of cases now, you now have an option. Do I go for Windows or do I go for Mac? And hey, most of the people's questions will be, well, I need to run this, I need to run this, I need to run this. Can it be run on Windows and Mac? And a lot of the time the answer is yes. And if a particular program isn't available for the Mac, but it is on Windows, there's generally some sort of other program, like a competitor or an alternative program to that one, that is available on the Mac as well, that does essentially the same sort of thing. So that is the big comparison between Windows and Mac. The Mac has grown a lot more. A lot of people like the Mac. You've got all your die-hard Apple geeks, your Apple fanboys that are so dedicated to the Mac that they hate Windows. And then you got the Windows guys that absolutely hate Apple. But you know what? They're both great operating systems that are growing and maturing very strongly. Apple is currently leading that in terms of the growth and innovation. Microsoft is still good, but they're the options between those two. And then lastly, we talk about Linux. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about Linux? Linux is known as an open source environment. Like, this is an open source operating system. What does open source mean? Well, open source is, how could I put it? You've got Microsoft and Apple who develop applications and essentially close their systems down. You're only allowed to do things on their systems that they allow you to do, right? So it's closed just to essentially to what Apple and what Microsoft allow you to do. There is not a open source community around the Apple and the Microsoft's operating systems. The Linux operating system is open source, which means that people can go in, they can go and develop, they can actually develop code for the operating system itself. They can provide improvements, suggestions, and future editions of the Linux operating systems can be improved with new functionality because of this open source community that surrounds the Linux operating systems. Now, when we're talking about Linux, Linux is essentially the word to describe many operating systems that surround or that are built upon the Linux architecture. Now, Linux in the back end is Unix based as well, similar to the Mac operating system, which is Unix based. But Linux has multiple operating systems that are available. Many of them are free, others are paid or require payment if you require support. So examples of your Linux operating systems would be Ubuntu, would be CentOS, and would be your Red Hat. These are generally your biggest ones. There are others out there. There are many other Linux distributions available. They're generally the three that I generally deal with in an enterprise environment: Ubuntu, CentOS, and Red Hat. Ubuntu and CentOS generally being free, open source, and you can do what you want. You can pay for support if you do want it. And then you've got your Red Hat. If you want to go down that route and have a better community in terms of support, you want to log tickets if you need help with an issue, or you need some extra help with setting up certain features, etc., etc. You've got the Red Hat Enterprise license editions, all those sort of things as well. Now, Linux comes sort of, we'll say, in two different flavors. You'll have a command line based, right, which is a CLI, a command line interface, or you have a GUI interface, which is your graphical user interface. The difference is, as the name suggests, command line is all command line. Nice black screen with some text, or a nice black screen with green text, or you can change your command line to whatever sort of colors you want. Your GUI is what you're familiar with in a Windows and a Mac environment. This is where you've got your start menu, you've got your Apple, your dock down the bottom, you've got all your icons on your desktop, you've got file, edit, view, you've got all those sort of nice features. You can drag and drop between your folders, copy, paste, do all that sort of stuff. We're using your mouse. In a command line interface, it's just command line, all right? Similar to on Windows, when you open up, MS-DOS, right, and you type in some of these commands, that is a big feature of the Linux operating system. Now, in Linux, this is very dependent on what you want to do in the Linux environment. In a lot of enterprises, in a lot of companies, a lot of places will choose not to go the GUI interface or the graphical interface. They're going to go just with command line. Now, the benefit of command line is that the operating system essentially requires less resources from the hardware. So if I'm going to build a computer, right, I'm going to have a physical computer and I'm going to have a particular sort of CPU, an AMD or an Intel, and I'm going to have a particular amount of RAM, 1 gig, 2 gig, 4 gig, 8 gig, 16 gig worth of RAM, whatever it may be. Because it is command line only, it generally will require less compute resources. So you can actually do more on a Linux operating system. You can install more stuff on it and have more power-hungry applications running on a command line version of Linux, because all of the pretty, graphical user interface stuff isn't there. So it's better in a sense that you do have better performance out of your environment. The only negative thing is for the end user, for the general end user, for the person working at home. You're not going to know how to navigate through a command line interface unless you've actually gone and learnt about it. You can learn about it, there's a whole bunch of forums online. You can go take a course, you can go get certified in some Linux, command line stuff. But generally, you will not just be able to pick it up and just know what to do. Some of the commands are pretty straightforward. You can just navigate through the navigations. You can do copy, you can do paste, you can move this, you can create a folder. You can do all that sort of stuff. But if you've never worked in the command line interface, it can be challenging to go down that route. So a lot of people will choose to install the graphical user interface component in your Linux installation. So when you're installing CentOS or Red Hat or whatever, there's an option there to install this graphical user interface. There's different flavors, essentially different faces for your different themes, we'll say, for your Linux installation, which essentially in the back end is running the code. But when you're clicking a button and saying copy this folder to paste this folder here, it's actually just executing that command in the back end on the command line interface. So when people generally talk about Windows, Mac, and Linux, the hardcore Linux guys, right? The guys who will just are die-hard Linux fans, most of the time they're going to be command line sort of guys because they like the flexibility, they've learnt the code, and frankly, it's a lot easier and a lot quicker. It's a heck of a lot quicker to do some command line stuff in Linux if you know what you're doing. You can navigate throughout the user interface a lot quicker if you know how to navigate through that command line interface. Now, we're going a little bit off track here on the command line, but Linux, similar to the Mac operating system, has been growing substantially over the years. Now, because it is open source, there's a big community around developing code, developing applications for that Linux, for those Linux operating systems, whether if it's CentOS, Ubuntu, or Red Hat, or others. So there is a lot of applications that are available now for Linux that weren't available previously. Windows generally held most applications, then Mac would be second, and then Linux would be third in terms of the amount of applications available. Having said all of that, there is programs available for your Linux operating systems that essentially emulate your Windows operating system, so you can actually install applications on Linux that are meant to be only run on Windows. So there is ways to get around that. But generally, if you're talking about Linux applications written specifically for Linux, that number is growing substantially because of this open source community. Similar to the Mac operating system, Linux is going to be less vulnerable to your attacks than your Windows counterparts. So that's something that you need to consider between all three options. Don't go into Linux unless you know what you're doing, is my opinion. If you want to go ahead and test it and install the graphical user interface and just play around with it, great, but make sure you secure it properly. Because by default, when you're installing Linux, there's some default passwords that are configured on the Linux operating system. So you need to go in and change a lot of stuff. You can disable the root access because a lot of people won't do that. So people who try to hack into a computer, the root access is still open and they can do, brute force attacks for a password and those sort of things. So having a good knowledge of how to use the Linux operating system is going to help you if you do want to go down that route. Linux is great. I've used it many, many years. I would definitely pick Linux over the Mac and over Windows for certain instances. A good example would be if I want to build a web server, if I want to have PHP and Apache and have a couple of websites running on a computer, it's a heck of a lot easier to have that running on Linux. It's a lot more powerful in terms of what I can do, and it's going to use a lot less resources, so I can dedicate those CPU and RAM resources for other operating systems. So that is my summary between the three. Windows is still your number one, Mac would be your number two, Linux would be your number three in terms of market share. The Mac and the Linux are growing substantially, and unless the Microsoft guys really get some innovation and start to develop a lot more stuff, they are going to get overtaken by Mac and by Linux. They are growing substantially quicker than your Microsoft fleet is. So that is my summary. I'm not going to tell you what would I recommend for one over the other. There are various recommendations as to which one I would pick over another, depending on the scenario. But we can leave that for another time. But that is my brief summary over Windows, Mac, and Linux. Three amazing operating system types. I would recommend you to play with all three of them and make up your own mind and your own decision as to which one is best for you. So if you found that video helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel Digital by Computing just on the button there for more videos.